All right, all of this happening with just 13 days until Election Day. No surprise there. Let's bring in Kash Patel. He's a senior national security advisor to former President Trump and served in Trump's first administration at the Pentagon. So, Kash, first of all, let's address what the vice president said a moment ago, that Trump is praising Hitler, according to John Kelly, his former chief of staff, who was also the Secretary of Homeland Security. He doesn't want a military that's loyal to the Constitution. He wants a military that's loyal to him. You worked in the Pentagon. What do you say?
Hey, it's great to be with you. Thanks for having me. Look, I was President of Staff of the Department of Defense, and what I saw was a man withdraw out of multiple theaters of conflict. What I saw was a commander-in-chief who brought home over 50 hostages and detainees from around the world. That's more than every president before him combined. What I saw was a man attend almost every single dignified transfer of the fallen and spend countless hours with the families of the fallen, giving them the love and care that they need, and most importantly, securing the financial assistance that they need. I saw this man host these individuals and their families in the Oval Office. I saw him prioritize our veterans and our uniformed military members to make sure they had the weapons that they needed and the munitions that they needed, especially if you were going to send them overseas to fight another man's war. And I saw, most importantly, more than anything, invoke the Constitution when it came to the National Command Authority and execute the mission, the no-fail mission of the United States of America and the Department of Defense to secure our freedom. So they can print whatever they want. And we could talk about the Vanessa Guillen story. I was there as his chief of staff at the Department of Defense for that one. But I saw a man as a commander-in-chief and President Donald Trump who fought our veterans and uniforms of the military. And if they want to call him Hitler and try to print out more disinformation, I guess that's all they got, because Kamala Harris could have brought home the hostages right now in Israel from a war she started with $7 billion she gave to Iran, and she hasn't brought home any of them. She started 2 more world wars.
All right, so you mentioned Vanessa Guillen, who was that young soldier at Fort Hood, Texas, who was murdered, and then her body was dumped in some wetlands. This article in The Atlantic that talks about Trump praising Hitler's generals also talks about the idea that in December of 2020, after meeting with the family in the Oval Office, and I attended that meeting, I was the pool reporter that day, that he had offered to pay portion of her funeral costs. There was a meeting, you were there, Chris Miller was there, the acting Secretary of Defense, Mark Meadows was there, Ben Williamson was there, I believe Mark Milley was there as well, where the subject of the funeral and the payment came up. Trump apparently said he was upset with the cost of the funeral that he had agreed to pay for, said something disparaging about her, and refused to pay. Was any of that true?
Absolutely not. Trump, when we brought to the attention the tragic murder of Guillen, who was serving in our armed forces, President Trump unilaterally stated we are going to give her the honor and dignity she needs and her family the assistance she needs. President Trump ensured that the Department of Defense gave Vanessa Guillen full military honors and paid for the entire financial package that was needed to secure and honor her memory. And if you don't want to believe me, a person who was there in the Oval Office along with Chris Miller, then believe the family. Vanessa Guillen's own sister and mother came out yesterday and specifically said that Donald Trump could not have been more gracious, caring, and loving as a commander-in-chief. And they said that what the Atlantic printed were outright lies, and they are desecrating the memory of the fallen. It is absolutely disgusting for me, who ran the Department of Defense, to see the politicization of our members, of our men and women who wore the cloth of our nation to defend us and our freedoms, and then to come out at the 11th hour to try and make up more stories. It's better that we question the folks and the sources like the Mark Milleys of the world, who took it upon himself to call our enemies in China and discuss war planning operations and politicize the Department of Defense rather than execute the National Command Authority and safeguard our mission. We are so sorry that Vanessa Guillen's family is going through this, but Donald Trump ensured that the DOD would pay for it. And what he said afterwards was maybe even more convincing of his commander-in-chief's command. He said if the military didn't pick up the tab, he would in its entirety. That's the commander-in-chief I want.
I want to come back to what the vice president said in just a moment, but again, it was July 30th, rather, 2020. I was in the Oval Office. I was the pool reporter when Vanessa Guillen's family, including Myra, her sister, were there. Here's what her sister said to the president about him meeting with the family, and he did it privately, and then opened up the Oval Office meeting to cameras because he wanted to get more attention placed on this. Listen to what Myra Guillen said.
I want to thank you for taking the time, taking us in. It's an honor to be able to meet you, and I know you're going to help us and, honoring our sister, passing the bell. And of course, I want to point out how is it that her chain of command failed drastically.
Yeah, I mean, that was quite a moment there. It was somber, it was respectful. I know the family very much appreciated it. All right, let's come back to what the vice president said a minute ago. This was at the top of her remarks. Listen here, Kash.
So yesterday we learned that Donald Trump's former chief of staff, John Kelly, a retired four-star general, confirmed that while Donald Trump was president, he said he wanted generals like Adolf Hitler had. Donald Trump said that because he does not want a military that is loyal to the United States Constitution. He wants a military that is loyal to him. He wants a military who will be loyal to him personally, one that will obey his orders even when he tells them to break the law or abandon their oath to the Constitution of the United States. In just the past week, Donald Trump has repeatedly called his fellow Americans the enemy from within, and even said that he would use the United States military to go after American citizens. And let's be clear about who he considers to be the enemy from within. Anyone who refuses to bend a knee or dares to criticize him would qualify, in his mind, as the enemy within, like judges, like journalists, like nonpartisan election officials. It is deeply troubling and incredibly dangerous that Donald Trump would invoke Adolf Hitler, the man who is responsible for the deaths of 6 million Jews and hundreds of thousands of Americans. All of this is further evidence for the American people of who Donald Trump really is. This is a window into who Donald Trump really is, from the people who know him best, from the people who worked with him side by side in the Oval Office and in the Situation Room. And it is clear from John Kelly's words that Donald Trump is someone who, I quote, certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, who in fact vowed to be a dictator on day one and vowed to use the military as his personal militia to carry out his personal and political vendettas. Donald Trump is increasingly unhinged and unstable. And in a second term, people like John Kelly would not be there to be the guardrails against his propensities and his actions. Those who once tried to stop him from pursuing his worst impulses would no longer be there, and no longer be there to rein him in. So the bottom line is this. We know what Donald Trump wants. He wants unchecked power. The question in 13 days will be, what do the American people want? Thank you.
So, Kash, I'm not quite sure why a presidential candidate comes out to react to a story in the way that she did, particularly a story that, even if it were true, is at least 4 years old, if not older than that, because John Kelly was gone as chief of staff not too far into the administration. And why would it come out now, just 13 days until Election Day?
Because they want to put President Trump and his powerful national security policy on defense. We are not going on defense. When President Trump was a commander in chief, he went on offense. He ended the forever wars. He crushed the narco traffickers. He brought home hostages. He ended child sex trafficking. And he was brave enough to use military assets in an expansive order to keep not only Americans safe, but the global world order safe. He made sure the DOD was no longer politicized and weaponized. Every one of the names she mentioned, all those individuals begged and auditioned to be in the positions they got. And when President Trump told them that the Department of Defense is a civilian chain of command, just like President Washington and our Constitution designated it to be, they did not like that. They were fighting off 60 years of the defense industrial complex owning the Department of Defense, and Donald Trump restored civilian authority to the chain of command. And he executed that when he asked for an investigation into Vanessa Guillen's death, tragic death, so we know what actually happened, and so the military could provide her the full honors and designation she deserves. That's the commander-in-chief they want. What they want now is us to react to headlines, and I'm going to remind the world what Donald Trump did. as our commander-in-chief. And I am going to remind the world that he was the one that did not politicize it and did not bend the knee to Washington, D.C. and the generals that have been going in and out of the defense industrial complex, raking in tens of millions of dollars off of another man's war and sending men and women to die for matters that aren't our own. That's what they are afraid of, that President Trump will restore the DOD to the civilian chain of command the Constitution demands and safeguard this world and our nation.
All right, Kash Patel, the former chief of staff at the DOD. Kash, thank you so much. Appreciate you joining us on short notice.
I'm Steve Ducey.
I'm Brian Kilmeade.
And I'm Ainsley Earhart. And click here to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page to catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis.